3, 2, 1, 0.
Welcome to Donuts and Bikes, the mountain biking coaching podcast. We're your hosts, Christian Jackson and Paul Howard, and we're here to discuss the skills, techniques, and tactics we use to progress our riders and coaches to become more skillful and confident, and ultimately have more fun on bikes. So click into our harder gear and get ready to dig deep into some of these skills. So Paul, thinking of clicking into a harder gear, you're just on the Downtime podcast. How's that for you, buddy?
Yeah. Hey, man. Yeah, it was cool. I was a little bit nervous because the Downtime podcast is a big deal if you're a mountain biker. So, but yeah, it was really good. It was interesting to see Chris and talk to Chris and see his interviewing skills. Just from that side of it, like from the podcast side of it, it was pretty cool. And as someone that isn't a mountain bike coach, to sort of see the way he constructed some of those questions and followed some of the content or discussion, that was pretty cool. He's clearly very good at what he does, but like most people, when they're really good at something, you don't quite appreciate how good they are until you try it yourself, kind of. And so I think he's very good at what he does.
Yeah, good point there. I really enjoyed the discussion of what you can do in your driveway in the winter. I thought that the way that he put those questions to you and how you responded through that part of it was really, really cool. So I encourage our listeners to go check that out.
Yeah. Hopefully the listeners will enjoy that. But that was sort of the basic concept, because I do it a lot in the winter, and especially when I'm in Australia, I don't always have trails to go ride. But so I end up just playing around on the roads or in the driveway, just goofing around on my bike to just be on my bike, and a little bit of time, just 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week. It's like it's like your average fitness thing, and it's crazy how much skill development you can build if you just do a little bit of playing around in your road, in your car park, in your driveway, a few times a week. So yeah, hopefully, if our listeners haven't heard it, check it out on the Downtime podcast, and you'll be hopefully surprised to hear what you can learn on some flat ground.
Yeah, for sure. A little sneak peek there. The emergency stop highlight for sure. Yeah. Hey, speaking of highlights, our last episode, we dug into cornering. Paul, what are some highlights from our discussion? Sorry to do that again. Paul, what are some highlights from that discussion that we had last time?
Good one. Highlights. I think the whole episode is a highlight. So if you haven't listened to it, you should.
Right.
It's a banger. I think the main thing I got from that was just how many things are involved with cornering, and the difference between how we do something and how we learn something, and sort of the classic YouTube video or less skilled coach always falls into that trap of like telling riders all the things you need to do through a corner, and then expecting that if they try A, B, C, D, and E, and maybe F and G, that will improve their cornering. But, a good coach understands that, sure, there's this whole sort of ingredient list of things to do in every corner, but if we actually want to get better, we just need to pull out one ingredient and just build a whole progression, build a whole lesson around that one ingredient, or in our case, we call it, one skill. So I think that was probably the highlight for me, was just that chat between, how to do it versus how to learn.
So Paul, speaking of progression, we have our first drops episode. So like cornering, this is going to be part one of the skills and techniques we use to teach drops to our riders who are new to the topic. We're going to cover some of the myths. We'll look at how we assess our riders, how we build risk management into our progression. We'll look at some of the basic skills and also some of the other factors that impact a rider's performance beyond their skills. All right, so let's get into this. Don't forget to listen all the way to the end where we talk about the donut of the day, and we hope you enjoy the show. Similarly to last time, we introduced this idea of corners by talking about some common myths we see in the teaching or the doing of cornering. Paul, are there any common sayings or ideas that you hear frequently in relationship to how to drop?
I think one of the most common ones we've seen over the years is kind of pull up or lean back, or both, pull up and lean back. I'd have to say those are probably the biggest ones, I'd say. Do you have any others?
Yeah, I hear quite frequently the word pull as the technique, right? It's just a pull. It's just a little pull. It's a hard pull or whatever. And I think that it's pervasive in a lot of places that I go. And I think it's important at this point to talk about what are the limitations of that kind of approach to a technique like drops. And for me, this kind of comes into the prescription, right? If we're going into this idea of drops, it's one technique. The reality is that all drops are different. That one technique may work on this first drop, but there are so many others that have different characteristics to them that might not be the right technique. And then most importantly for us in talking about coaching and teaching of drops is that it introduces the idea of risk management and safety. Except up to this point, the things that we've been talking about, especially cornering, the consequences of not getting it right in a corner are typically not dramatic. Whereas contrast to not getting things right with a drop, we're then introducing some elements that could be dangerous, hazardous to the rider.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we often look at like risk management in terms of like probability versus consequence. So yeah, both of those kind of are ramped up as soon as we start getting in the air. Basically, probability of something going wrong is higher, and then consequence if something goes wrong is higher as well. So that's where the risk management really starts to kick in through that matrix there.
Yeah, and let's use that as a point to introduce this idea of if we have a rider that has said they want to start learning how to drop, what are some things that we need to be looking for in that rider's riding? And then perhaps what are some ways that we're going to warm this rider up before we even start looking at the teaching of drops? Paul, what are some things that we need to be looking for with this rider and their riding?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is just the fundamental skills. So just their position, balance on the bike. Are they comfortable being centered? And can they stay centered when they're challenged? So usually if someone wants to learn jumps or drops, we'll ride for a little bit and we'll just make sure that they're a rider that can control their body position on the bike, and compressions through berms or rough terrain doesn't automatically cause their position to sink back or position to get stiff. So that's a good place to start. And with that, moving on from that, also just their mobility, not just whether they can be centered, but can they move? Can they move the bike underneath them? Can they move on top of the bike? Can they lean the bike? Just a little bit of mobility so that, sometimes you get riders that are quite centered, they're quite good at their positioning, but they're quite stiff, they're quite static. So we often talk about both sides of the coin, not just one side of the coin. So a good position, a good balance as well, good mobility as well. And then some basic prerequisites for drops is some kind of the classic ones are the wheel lifts. Like, can they do a front wheel lift, a rear wheel lift, maybe a bit of a level lift? Because those maneuvers kind of show a lot of pressure control skills as well, that the rider can kind of push and create some pressures. The rider can release and unweight the bike, and release those pressures, unweight the bike. you can kind of think of these as like the core ingredients that you need for the drop off. You need good position and balance. You need some good pressure control skills, and then obviously a sense of timing. So those wheel lifts, especially if they're doing them over a stick or something, it shows that the rider understands timing in terms of speed and distance. So if they can do a front and rear wheel lift over a stick and get the timing right, they've probably spent some time just feeling out approach speeds, too early, too late to kind of compress or unweight the wheel. So straight away, there's some things I look at. It's just some cornering, some general riding, and then just some wheel lifts. And those wheel lifts are a really nice way to warm up. A lot of the time we'll do what's called a stick test and maybe a quick review of a front wheel lift lesson where the rider stays fairly neutral and centered on the bike, and they're really just using a fairly centered kind of compressed down and up movement to just slightly unweight the front wheel so it can go over the stick. And they get the timing and the speed right so that the front wheel doesn't land until after the rear wheel has passed the stick. So in that sense, we're kind of pretending the stick is the drop and that the rider has a sense of timing of speed and distance, and they can take those factors into account and then execute a front wheel lift so that, if you imagine the stick was the drop, the bike would be pretty much level off the small drop. It's just for a very small drop. And then obviously the whole goal of drop-offs is to control nosedive. That's it in a nutshell. Like for riders out there wanting to learn how to do drops, the main technical focus is controlling nosedive. And sometimes you don't want the nosedive, you want the bike to be fairly level off a drop, and so that both wheels land fairly together. And sometimes you actually want a little bit of nosedive because the landing is sloped. So that's sort of one core message when we teach drop-offs is training riders to control how much nosedive the bike and the rider has off the drop. So they're controlling that, and the terrain isn't controlling that. But that's a good warm-up. Just some skill assessments, some wheel lifts, bit of a stick test. Sometimes that takes 1 minute, 2 minutes. Sometimes it turns into a lesson itself. But at least that way, when you get to the drops, you're ready for it. You're either warmed up physically or technically or mentally, and you're ready to roll.
Excellent. As you're speaking there at the end, the idea of being warmed up mentally resonated with me as kind of a bit of the prerequisite of that I use as a coach. Somebody's coming to me with wanting to learn about drops. I really want to try to understand why they want to learn this. And I've had the situations where riders are mentally ready. They're genuinely wanting to learn how to do this. They envision themselves doing it. Then sometimes riders feel like they need to or have to learn to do this. And there's a bit of a different progression than that comes into play there with these riders in terms of their motivation for wanting to do this. So we really need our riders to be very mentally focused on the pieces to this and the positive outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think as soon as the wheels leave the ground, that's where people inherently know, it's getting real now and there's risk. So inherently the fear or the anxiety can come in a lot more compared to just learning body position down a trail or learning some cornering. So the coach's role and is really to manage that anxiety or that fear that your student might be feeling. And I think the best place to start is when you're teaching drops. So teaching anything which the students may potentially be anxious or nervous about is empathy. And really, and empathy really, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but people don't always dig into it enough. But empathy is genuinely being in their shoes. So for often you get coaches that are very natural athletes that they probably learned to do drops. I don't know. As a kid, they can't even remember when they learned them. They could probably always do drops as far as they're concerned. They were never really in that place where learning to do a drop was a big, scary thing. So it's hard for them to, they say they can be empathetic, but it's hard for them to be genuinely empathetic because they can't really remember being in that same position where they were looking at that feature or that thing and feeling nervous or feeling scared. So what that achieves, I think, is if you can be genuinely empathetic, either to your friend if you're out riding with your mates or to your student if you're a coach, is really try and be in try and be in their shoes. And then that's where those warm-ups kick in. If you just do a stick test or some wheel lifts or even just a roll down, if the drop's pretty small and you can roll it, warm up with a roll down. Because all that's doing is it's just providing mileage and time for the student to take things easy and to not rush. I think rushing things and not being aware that you might be rushing yourself if you're a rider, or you might be rushing your student if you're a coach, is pretty much guaranteed recipe for increased anxiety or increased fear. So just being really aware of that empathy, I think, will help you approach the progression and ultimately too manage risk. I mean, the classic, as you know, like the classic reason, the most common reason why people crash on drops is they're trying something which they don't have the technique or the skill for, and or they're just progressing too quickly. They're just trying something too soon.
That reminds me of our first episode, Slow Smooth. We talked about that idea of not rushing individually and the process. And I think for our coaches listening out there and riders as well, like this is a really key message to the learning of drops. It's to really trust the process that we're going to talk about here. And as a coach, I think this is a really good point to highlight how risk management, it can be embedded into a teaching progression in ways that allow the coach to be managing the risk and the student to be genuinely open to learning, right? And so if we're structuring our lesson with drops in a logical way, it's progression based with the right speed, the right size, the right shapes, the right techniques, then we're moving things forward in a very controlled and predictable way that makes me as the coach relax, right? So I don't have any sort of red flags or warning lights going off, and the rider feels the same way, and it should be like it should never be scary, right?
Yeah, totally.
Here at the beginning, it shouldn't be scary for sure, and anytime where there's some apparent fear, then that as a coach to me tells me that maybe I missed something somewhere along the lines. I need to step back and take a bigger look.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me, like I always tell my students, like if you're trying something and you have like butterflies in your tummy, usually it's a sign that you're there too soon. And for the coaches too, like if your student is trying something and you're standing there watching them and you're like, oh, I hope this goes well. Like you're just there too soon. Like it doesn't matter. Like I've been teaching drops and jumps for years, and I have been teaching people on big stuff, right? Like big drops, 8-10 foot drops or 30+ foot jumps. And if I'm standing next to a 30+ foot jump or a big, 15 foot road gap, and I'm no more anxious or nervous than if I'm watching a beginner student do a front wheel lift on a flat grassy field. Like there's no more, and that's kind of my judgment. It's like if I'm watching somebody do a drop, I should feel the same as if I'm watching somebody change gears in a field. Like there should be, and if I don't feel that, then chances are maybe we've just progressed too early. Because I'll often say to the coaches, like, your number, first goal of teaching is safety. First goal of riding is try not to get hurt. I mean, that should always be your first goal. The second goal is like have fun, but your first goal should be like, let's go for a ride and not kill ourselves. So I say to coaches, like, you think you're a mountain bike instructor, but you're not. You're a mountain bike risk manager. That's your title. You're a risk manager. We just call you instructor because it sounds cool. But right. Really your job is you're a risk manager. And going back to what you said earlier, like, it just reminded me of, like, good teaching is good risk management. They're the same thing. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you want to learn more about us, please check out our first info episode, which digs into who we are, what we do, and our background in the coaching and mountain bike industry. You can also check us out on Instagram at Donuts and Bikes, or our podcast website is the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast.buzzsprout.com. All right, back to the show.
Yes. And let's just take a second and really highlight what you said there about how you as the coach feel on a 15-foot road gap with your student versus a flat grassy field doing a wheel lift. Like, the feeling is from the coach needs to be the same, right? I think that's a really important piece to communicate here to our coaches listening. And Paul, next, let's get into some of the details of how we achieve that with our riders by going through some of the steps and with the techniques of drops. So our first, once we've got our students warmed up and ready to go, we need to talk about, the anatomy of a drop, kind of check out what we're going to do. What kind of size drops do we need to be starting out on with our new riders, Paul?
I like to start on something good, at least 5-6 feet high. Just get the.
Just go for it.
And I'll
go fast and pull up.
Hey, follow me. This is rad. Follow me. You're gonna love it. No, so I'll always try and start on, like, the smallest feature I can find. So essentially something you can roll off, roll down, regardless of your technique. If you happen to get the timing completely wrong, or whatever you do, you simply end up just rolling away. So, the classic case is like a 6-inch drop, like a side of a curb. Obviously, you can't teach off curbs because they usually end up going onto roads, but that just gives you an idea. So something you can roll down 6-inch, maybe 1 foot is like as big as I'll go for the first time somebody's doing a drop. And the nice thing with drops is, like, you can learn a lot of advanced techniques on drops no bigger than like 2, maybe 3 feet high. Like, you don't need to be on big drops to learn 95% of the tools that you need. So especially from a coaching point of view, there's very few excuses for, like, teaching somebody on anything big, because you can do most of your homework on pretty small drops. And for the riders out there, I would say, like, in terms of how do we incorporate this risk management, well, I guess for the riders and the coaches, it's all about patience and progression. Get mileage doing smaller things and building good technique, building muscle memory. Because, the simplest and most common reason why people get hurt on drops is they don't do that. They increase the size too soon, or they go too big too soon. Start with your stick tests, your warm up, your wheel lifts. It gets your muscles in your lower back warmed up anyway. Find a small drop and just start off with point of commitment. So if we get into the technical side of it, point of commitment is one of our key risk management tools. So it's going to be a good ways back from the drop. And essentially, it just trains riders to get ready early. That's another common reason why people crash on drops, is they stand up at the last minute, or they brake at the last minute, or they try and pedal and pick up speed at the last minute. So point of commitment, apart from anything else, it helps train your trail scanning skills, because It trains you to spot the feature early and to get ready early. So once you pass that point of commitment, you're already standing up. You're in the right gear. You're pointing in the right direction. You're not turning in the last second. Brakes are off, and you're just coasting, ready to roll off the drop. So just practice rolling down, rolling through the feature. Practice your point of commitment. You might need a few goes just to figure out where you start and what gear you might need to be in and how much you need to pedal to get up to speed. You also want to just feel what the drop's like and then what the exit is like. So point of commitment, feature, and an exit. Because all of these things boil down to when you do start catching some air and getting some drops, you're just taking all these little things one at a time. So yeah, learn the point of commitment, learn the approach, learn the speed, size, and shape and feel of the drop, learn the exit, and then you've learned all that stuff. So when you do actually get to the point where, okay, now I'm going to apply some technique to catch some air, you're purely just focusing on that technique, and you're not focusing on where do I pedal and what's my point of commitment and how much do I need to brake after the drop so I don't keep going and run through the fence or whatever it is, right? So yeah, stick tests, roll downs, point of commitments. That's a really nice progression just to warm up and get started. And then once you're ready and your drop is, I don't know, maybe 6 inches, maybe 1 foot high, and you're feeling really warmed up and ready, then you're ready to get into the actual technique of catching some air and controlling the bike's nosedive off the drop. And that's where we get into the ratios. So maybe I might just sort of pass the microphone over and do you want to kind of go through some of the press, absorb, poke and tell our listeners about that kind of ratio of technique, what they do?
Yeah, I like to think about the techniques once we're ready to actually physically commit to the drop as dials. And we'll talk about why they're dials in a bit. But again, this idea of press, absorb, and poke as 3 distinct things that happen for the drop. And I'll take the press on here for just to start this. Once we're on the drop feature, whether it's a rock or wood or whatever, we're wanting the goal to be to control the trajectory of the bike as it goes off the drop feature. The press is the concept of loading both ends of the bike, the front and the rear, slightly so that we are stabilizing the bike and getting it ready for exiting the drop, right? And so we're doing this by pressing to the pedals with the feet to load the bike slightly so that the bike is ready then to be controlled as it goes off the drop. So the second piece of this is the absorb. And what happens with the absorb is that we need to release the press a little bit so that the wheels are not interacting with the actual lip of the drop in a negative way. So there's not actual input that's happening from the 90-degree edge, so to speak, of the drop that's getting pushed into the rear wheel specifically, which can lead to a bit of a nosedive. So this is I like to think about lightening my feet a bit, and again, we'll talk about the dials. So the timing of this becomes important. And the third piece of this, the poke, is the idea of extending the arms to poke the bike forward to minimize the duration of the 2 wheels exiting the edge, so that we are controlling the trajectory. And these 3 things in combination then for the rider create the trajectory for us in a way that causes both wheels then to land at the same time on the landing.
Nice. I like that. Like, I think the common one with the press and absorb, like I'll tell a lot of riders, is like really it's like 2 halves of one movement, because you kind of mostly through the leg. Because I always remind riders, like the bottom bracket's almost in the middle of the bike. So if I load mostly with my legs, automatically I'm loading both wheels. But yeah, a gentle press, kind of press down, and it immediately, the second half of that movement is to absorb and go nice and light and unweight, um, like you said. So yeah, and I think the key thing, if you think of like the bike going off the drop, if the bike is a little light, clearly that's going to minimize the nosedive. And that's really the purpose. That's the why behind that press and absorb is straight away with that press and absorb, regardless of anything else we do, that just gets the bike nice and light. And so that front wheel doesn't nosedive straight away. And then therefore the rider has some input into the bike. And now the rider is taking control over when and how much that bike nosedives. Yeah, and like you said, for the poke, I really like that idea of like, if you think of a bike going really slowly off the drop, there's quite a long time difference, right, between the front wheel leaving the ground and then the back wheel leaving the ground. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. And that just creates lots of nosedive, whereas if you're going really fast, it's almost like the two wheels leave the drop at the same time. And so naturally the bike doesn't nosedive as much, if at all. So I always try and get my riders to think like, here's the technique, here's what we're doing, and here's how we're doing it, and then here's the why. And when you're teaching drops or you're learning drops, any input before you go off the lip, the input is to control how much or if the bike is going to nosedive, and that just puts them in the right frame of mind. Because really we often say like, if we're going to do these more advanced features, we have to be a driver, not a survivor. We can't freeze up. And that's where the mental component comes in. If we rush too quickly, you can explain the technique greatly to your students. But if there's fear and anxiety, it doesn't matter how well you teach it, they're going to freeze up, and then they're going to be surviving, not driving.
Yeah. So at this point, I think it'd be good to talk about the idea that we're training our riders in these three techniques: the press, absorb, the poke, on our small drop, our 6-inch drop, maybe a 1-foot drop. And the main thing that we're trying to instill in them is there's these three concepts then become dials for us, meaning they're things that we can adjust as a rider based on our speed that we're entering the drop with, the size of the drop, and the shape of it. Is it downward facing? Is the landing downsloping? Is it more flat, et cetera, right? And so then we might run through, a series of variations with the rider on slowing down to maybe a walking pace, and experimenting with the press, absorb, and the poke in different ratios to see what the results are. And we may speed up as well. And we're doing this, again, back to the idea of us as risk managers on a very small drop, where the consequences of not getting the timing right are relatively zero, right? And so in running through this drill, we're showing the rider a lot of variety in how they can adapt this technique to a changing environment, which in my mind is one of the end goals of teaching someone how to drop. Is it's not to prescribe, here's how it's a press, absorb, poke necessarily, but you need to be in control, you need to be the driver, and you need to adjust these things based on what you see.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the biggest message in a nutshell. It's like my pet peeve over the years is magazine articles saying this is how you drop, and then the reader kind of takes away like, oh, I've got to do A, B, C, and I do that on every drop. And essentially, that's the myth right there. There is no one way of doing a drop, because the 3 S's always change: speed, size, shape. And if one of those S's changes, then the technique essentially can change. So one thing I like about that warm-up is like stick tests and wheel lifts, front wheel lifts over a stick, is the rider's kind of working on that press and absorb component. Just press into the bike and then come up and absorb, and the wheel will start to lift. Neutral, press, absorb. So they've kind of almost worked on that piece of the puzzle. And then if they warm up by just rolling through the feature, a lot of the time I'll just talk about, well, as you go over the drop, poke the front wheel down, extend your arms a little bit, and absorb the rear wheel. So poke and absorb. And in that sense, if you think of those two pieces of the warm-up, we're introducing these concepts, these biomechanics, these movements before we even catch air and actually leave the ground and do the drop the way we want to do the drop. So straight away in that progression, they're learning those dials, those separate pieces, and it goes back to patience again. Like I'm sure you've seen it. Like the most common thing is where like people will do one drop. They're like, oh sweet, I did it. I'll go hit the bigger one. But what they really need to do is stay on that same drop and do it slower, do it faster. Try and land a little deeper. Try and land a little higher up, a little closer to the takeoff. Try and take some of those S's, speed, size, shape, and vary those S's on the same feature. And that's where we create safe risk management, but also much better skill development. So it goes back to what we said earlier in one of the trails episodes, where like people tend to think the only way to get better is to ride gnarlier terrain. And it's the same with drops. People think, well, okay, the only way to get better is to hit the bigger drop. It's not. It's stay on the same drop and adjust those dials and play with your technique and your timing. That's really how you're going to get much more competent and confident and safer off a huge variety of drops. Because that's the other thing. If you think of the real world, like you've got bike parks, obviously, and they have slightly more man-made, purpose-built drops. But even in bike parks and a lot of trails outside of bike parks, drops vary like wildly. So this idea of like, this is how you do drops is kind of crazy because literally every drop is different. So chances are it needs a different recipe.
Drops in the wild. I like that. But you're right. If you think about, especially here in Pisgah, we don't have a lot of drops per se, but the ones that exist out on the trails are wildly different. And they all sorts of different kinds of approach run-ins and landings and et cetera. Something I'd like to come back to, the way to progress is not going bigger in this case. One of the things I like to think about with the varying the speed is, once we start going faster and the riders are going deeper in a controlled way, is really looking at their position in the landing. Have they maintained a center through the air, and are they landing centered? And are they managing the pressure of the landing? And once they've kind of got out the press absorb poke and a little bit of the ratios, then we start coaching towards that. And then we're really building in some safety and some finer tuning pieces that's going to serve that rider in a lot of different scenarios. We haven't even gone to a larger drop yet.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you want to learn more about us, please check out our first episode, which digs into who we are, what we do, and our background in coaching and mountain bike industry. You can also check us out on Instagram at Donuts and Bikes, or at our podcast, the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast.buzzsprout.com. And now back to the show.
Totally, and it's such a good reminder that, like, when you're learning drops, really you're developing your skills. Don't just think of like, how do I do the drop? Also think of your skill, like, okay, what's my position and balance, or how do I load? How do I push and create some pressure or release the pressure, or what's my timing? Like, as a rider, you're not just learning drops, you're learning skills. So have those skills in your mind as well. And the same thing for a coach. You're not just teaching that trick or your maneuver. Like a good coach teaching a drop-off lesson, really you're teaching position and balance, pressure, and timing. You're teaching the three skills at once. That's really what you're doing, because they're the tools the student needs to dial in that drop. So I quite like that you mentioned, like, what do you do if you go slower? Like, if I rewind back to that,
Yes.
because I think it's good to highlight that a little bit. Like, if the rider goes a bit slower off the drop, slower means the bike's got more tendency to nosedive. So we're going to add a little bit more energy into that press and absorb so that the front wheel stays more level off the drop. And we may need to put a little bit more energy into that poke just to help get the bike off the drop a bit quicker. So that's just an example of, like, if we take 1S, the speed, we slow it down, how does that impact those press absorb pokes? And then if we reverse it and we speed it up, you can think, if we're going faster off a drop, obviously the rider can land pretty deep, right? So now we need to just start thinking of, how can I go faster off a drop but not necessarily land flat or land too far away, especially if it's a sloped landing. So the press and absorb could be dialed down. Like, the speed in itself is reducing the nosedive. So speed is another factor that controls nosedive. So if I'm going faster and there's less nosedive in the first place, then my nosedive controlling tools, as I like to call them, your press, absorb, poke, I don't need them as much. So press and absorb might be more gentle. It may even get to the point where I actually don't need a poke at all. It's just a very gentle kind of compress and unweight of the bike, just very slight. And with the additional speed, that means I'm going to be nicer controlled off the drop. And then the timing kicks in too, right? Like, if I'm going faster into the drop, the rider needs to be aware that those movements need to happen earlier, a little bit further away from the edge of the drop. And vice versa, if you're going slower, those movements, those techniques, they need to happen a bit later, a bit closer to the edge of the drop. And riders can really feel that with wheel lifts over sticks on the grass. Like, you can learn so much about speed and timing and not have any drops. And half the time when people get it wrong on the drop, it's not because they can't do a front wheel lift or press and absorb or poke. They're actually quite good at those movements. They just got the timing wrong. And you can quadruple and multiply your timing skill development in a completely safe environment. I mean, you can literally do it in your driveway. You can get better at drops by trying different wheel lifts over your sticks at different speeds in your driveway or on the road in front of your house or something.
Absolutely. And just to highlight again what you said here is that we're using drops to teach skills, and the skills that we're teaching are position, pressure control, timing, coordination, right? So those become really important for us in this next piece, which is the question of when is our rider ready to go to the next size drop? Say we want to go to a 2-foot size drop. As a coach, what I'm looking for in my rider are the three C's. So I want to see the correct movements in the correct position, correct pressure, correct timing, coordination, with varying of the speed. Primarily here, I need to see consistency in this. Multiple repetitions. Yeah, consistency. When we slow down, is the rider able to maintain the correct timing and coordination of the movements? And then you see some confidence, right? And so I need to be observing those three things. And as I'm using those three C's as a bit of my rubric as I'm watching my riders, and I'm not going to be communicating those things to them, but I'm observing them, and I'm using that as.
How do you, like, for our listeners, like, how do you assess confidence? Like, what does confidence look like when they're riding or when they're doing a drop? Or, like, can you kind of describe that? Because obviously, again, I was just thinking, we're on a podcast, we can't show them. Like, how would you describe
you can,
what a confident rider looks like versus an unconfident rider. Is that the right?
yeah. Well, I think that there's a couple ways to approach that. The first, let's look at the confident rider. There are nonverbal body language cues that we can see with confidence. We can see facial expressions. We can see the way that they're, holding their posture out, if they're standing out afterwards. So there's nonverbal pieces to that. It may be obvious in something they say that felt, they may say that felt great, that felt right, I got it right this time, right? That self-talk about this is a sign of confidence. From the other side of that coin, we sometimes will see frustration. Of why can't, again, back to the language, why can't I get this right? Why does my front wheel keep diving? And that tends to erode a bit of confidence. Then, as a coach, we need to navigate those two pieces and, be coaching on that empathetic level as well. So those are two areas that I look at in terms of confidence. I like to use a lot of positive affirmation and positive reinforcement with the riders, using video feedback for the riders if they're willing to see this, and if you've created, again, back to our episode on learning and how we learn, if you've created a good learning environment where everybody's open and ready to learn, and using some video feedback can really reinforce positive movements, even if not everybody in your session is getting it right. You're able to highlight something that somebody's doing well. And so I think that all that together kind of creates that idea of confidence, and those 3 C's for me. Again, back to the rubric, I typically have made my decision before the students have. Right. Well, I've always made my decision before the students have if we're going to the next size drop or not. Yeah. Right. And so and then, once we've decided to do that, it's they're ready for it physically and mentally. And it's, again, back to your point, I don't feel any different than I would, doing a wheel lift in a car park.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's it. And it's just patience on the rider's behalf and patience on the coach as well. Let's pick a feature, let's warm up, let's roll it. Let's try a press, absorb, poke, catch some air at a kind of a regular, normal speed based on the terrain and the environment. Try it slower. Talk about how those techniques need to be adjusted. Try it faster. Again, how do those techniques and the timing need to be adjusted? It's kind of a basic template. Just warm up, try it slower, try it faster. And each time, each one of those phases, you're looking for the 3 C's. Like in the warm-up phase, I want to see them roll down 3 times and show me the 3 C's, Before we try it faster or slower, I want to see the 3 C's before I change the speed, right? And consistent, comfortable, or confident and correct. You can add more C's like cute and crazy and cuddly, but they don't really help when you're teaching. But I often say that with my kids. I'm like, you got to look extra cute off this drop, and they're like, what? Anyway, but the consistent one, I do like to quantify that. So if we just shine a light real quick, but like, I'll ask coaches a lot of the time, what does consistent really mean? And they're like, well, at least 3 times. And I usually go to 5 because 3, one of them could be a fluke. So now they've done it twice. So I kind of riders and coaches to really, like, if you're going to increase the risk, then can you do what you're doing consistently? And consistently means you've done it 4 or 5 times in a row, comfortably and correctly. Yeah, just I wanted to add that little number there to one of those C's.
Yeah, and once I've made my coaching decision and I've seen that consistency, and again, I think 5 is very reasonable, and especially in this scenario, like slowing down and speeding up, and then the pace in between. like we're looking at like 15 reps that we're seeing consistency there. Like, so we're at five, it's all across the board. I like to ask, are you ready to move on? Are we ready to go to the next drop? And, and sometimes we get a yes, and sometimes a rider has put their entire bandwidth into the, into the press absorb poke, the controlling the nosedive, all these things, and they need a break and they're not ready to go on at this point. And that bandwidth it's saturated. And that's okay. And we, as in the coaching world, we need to then acknowledge that. And you know what? Let's just go ride our bikes for a while.
I think that's a really cool point that I want to unpack that a little bit, because
okay,
you'll see coaches where a student might have crashed doing something. It could be drops, it could be anything. And the common thing you hear is like, but they were ready for it. Like we did A, B, and C, and we were ready to go do D, and like they ticked all that, they were ready for it, and then they crashed. And so technically it's like they've done their due diligence, they've gone through this progression, they haven't rushed, they've got the 3 C's, but the rider still ended up crashing. And so, it's a really nice point, I think, to going back to that risk management matrix. What makes good risk management? Lots of stairs, lots of smaller steps instead of fewer, bigger steps. This basic building block concept, right? Warming up before you try things, quantifying things before you increase the challenge level. There's all classic kind of risk management tools. The other one is being aware of like, what are the performance factors a rider needs to execute something. So they've got their physical, psychological, technical, tactical environment and equipment. Physical and technical, let's just pick out those two. Technically, the student's looking good. They've just nailed it. They've done it slower and faster, and they look solid. Okay, let's move on to the next drop. Oh, hang on a minute. We forgot about the physical. They're knackered. They're tired. And the physical fatigue, guess what? That impacts the psychological, the mental component. So now the rider comes up to that bigger drop, suddenly at the last second gets a bit of anxiety or second guessing or fear, doesn't commit to the drop, and then crashes. But then the rider and the coach are both scratching their heads like, what happened? You were totally ready for this. Technically, they were ready for it. Physically, they were not ready for it. They were tired. And the physical impacted the mental right at the wrong point at the wrong time. So just being really aware, you're part of your risk management matrix as a coach is to constantly assess not just the technical progression, but the physical progression in the lesson or the psychological components in the lesson. If they start getting quiet, are they getting quiet because they're confident, or are they getting quiet because they're just tired now and they need to go have a snack break and an ice cream?
Right.
Yeah.
I would add another layer to that in the sense of student goals versus instructor goals. If you think in the lesson, in you're thinking about those performance factors are critical, but then as a coach having the self-assessment of, am I wanting them to get to the 5-foot drop, or are they wanting to get to it?
Yeah.
And that there's, it takes a bit of self-awareness to recognize that, and a bit of empathy and humility as well, to recognize that sometimes we as coaches maybe want things for our students that maybe they don't want themselves, or they don't need themselves. And I hear this sometimes both in the coaching world and in personal writing world, of people saying, "Hey, you've got this, right? You can do that. You can do this. I want to see you do it." The reality is that maybe they can, maybe they can't. But for us as coaches is, thinking back to our lots of smaller steps, risk management kind of technique here, is that we need to know for sure that they're ready to do this, they can do it, and they're mentally, physically, et cetera, ready for it. And it's not a gamble at this point.
I really like that. I think what helps address that is at the start of the lesson, setting expectations. So part of your risk management could be like, doesn't matter how well you progress, we're just going to hang out here for 15 minutes and then we're going to go ride and do something else. Because I think a lot of that, you can fall into those traps when you're in a little zone. Maybe you've got a skills area and there's some drops, and it's easy just to keep hiking, keep trying the same drop. Or there's a bigger one right next to it. You're in that environment where like, well, technically they've got this drop and there's a bigger drop next to them. Like when we're here, so you're sort of in this perfect environment to be like, well, let's just do the bigger one. But maybe they're tired. So I think a lot of the time when I start my drop-off lesson or something, I'll just say, well, let's just do a bit of a drops session for 15, 20 minutes. It does get tiring mentally, just concentrating a lot. Physically, just hiking up this little section to go back up. So let's just see where we get to in 15 minutes. We'll go ride for a bit, and then maybe after lunch we can come back for another 15 minutes. I found a lot more success in if a rider wants to improve their drop-off techniques, instead of doing a 1-2 hour drop-off session, just kind of almost breaking up that 1 hour or 2 hour session over 3 or 4 lessons where we kind of do a section each time. So that's just another approach. And it really depends on the rider. Some riders have the fitness and the mental resilience to just smash out a drop session for an hour, but some riders won't. So again, it's just knowing your rider and managing risk according to the unique skill set and conditioning of your student.
Cool. So something that I just thought about as we were talking here, just kind of bring up drop and skills areas, trail design, park design kind of things. I like to teach drops in a place if there's a series of maybe 3 drops. It's just maybe a 1, 2, 3 foot drop, so that the 5 and 6 foot drop are not within the view of the riders. Because oftentimes if you're in a place where you're teaching on a smaller drop and there's much larger drops around, there's a bit of perhaps unspoken or sometimes even spoken anxiety about, you're going to make me drop off this right at the end. And I'm not ready for that yet. And so like just designing our areas and taking students to these areas where that's not even on the table at the beginning can create an environment where it's a lot more productive for learning.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's a big thing for our listeners is don't try and learn drops on crappy drops. Like you just reminded me of like one of the toughest things I find riders have is like learning to do a drop on a good quality drop. And they're like, I can't do drops. I find them really difficult. And then you end up sort of learning where they're trying to learn how to do a drop. And you're like, well, I hit all sorts of drops and I'm not hitting that drop. That's sketchy. Like right. It's just built really badly, or there's like a really slow, awkward run in. And I'm like, no wonder you find drops horrible. That's a horrible drop. And that's something where we definitely need as an industry with bike parks and trail builders to, if I had to pick one thing that is built inconsistently and a lot of the time is not built as well as it could be for safe, effective learning, it is drops. It really is. Like a lot of the time they'll build small drops are easier to build better because they are small. But a lot of the time you get to these sort of man-made 5 foot, 6 foot drops, and the size might be okay, but the shape is wrong. So the landing, the landing's too short or too steep or too flat, or the approach for that size of the drop is now too short. So when you're building drops, it's not just the drop. If you sort of quote unquote, a good drop zone includes a well thought out and designed approach a good shape and size drop for the speed based on that approach. And then a really good landing and exit, again, based on the size and shape and speed of the drop that precedes it. So how drops are built and designed is definitely an area that our industry has a lot of work to do on. And again, just for the listeners, if you're out there and you're struggling on the drops near your home or on your home trails, be kind to yourself. Sometimes it might be you and your technique, but sometimes it's just the horrible drops. And if it was, I've had it a lot of times. I travel around the world every year teaching mountain biking, and there's a lot of the times people would take me to their local drops, and I'd be like, "Wow, that is sketchy." I'm riding around it, and it's not even that big. It's like a 3-foot drop. I'm not touching that with a barge pole. Yeah. What
Excellent.
do you think?
Yeah, agreed. And from a trail building perspective, there's intentionally no standard on drops or jumps for that matter. Like there's a purposeful ambiguity for this, so that trail builders have the flexibility to do what they need to do within their situation. The pros and cons to that, the pro is that there isn't, because there isn't a prescription, then the liability becomes less for the trail system or the builder. But the cons for it is that, just as you said, the quantity of sketchy things out there, and like honestly, like a lot of times wrong speeds, it can become problematic.
I think understanding the 3S is like, if you're trail builders or you're friends with a trail builder, you can't just think of what size drop am I going to build or what shape drop. It has to be what size and what shape and what's the speed of this trail. Like, because it's good to, I think, separate like drops in a skills area, which is off the trail, like a drop zone. That's where it should really be more consistent. Yeah. I still think on trails, trail builders should have the artistic license to build whatever drop that suits that trail.
Right.
But it still needs to take into account those 3 S's and not just one of them.
Yeah. And on that note, in a skills area, if you're having 3 consecutive drops, the 3 S's need to be consistent across those 3 drops. And so drop 1, the same speed needs to be applied to each of them in this shape, and so that you've got maybe sometimes you see like the first 2 require this speed and this kind of this amount of poke or whatever, and then the third one has something completely different. So if you're trying to teach towards that, all of a sudden you've got like a disconnect with the progression there, and that can, if people are just listeners out there are trying to learn on their own, that creates this inconsistency that's hard to adapt to.
So for you, when does a rider maybe delete? If we just get back into the drops a little bit, and the press absorb poke, when might a rider completely delete the press and just use the absorb pokes? What would be that scenario?
Typically, faster speeds.
Yeah,
it would be the kind of the first go-to. Maybe both the drop and the landing point downward, perhaps as well. Yeah, so that's a common scenario.
Maybe bigger as well, like faster or bigger. So at that point, like, because it's a bigger drop and they're going faster, if they're adding that press and absorb, they're kind of adding essentially lift in a way, or I quite like the word loft to the bike. So it's going to go out in the air further and then potentially land too deep or get too much air. And so the absorb in that case becomes quite different in that it's not preceded by a press. So when the absorb doesn't have a press as the first half of that move, it's quite hard to do. So commonly what I kind of categorize it like basic drops for intermediate riders. We usually say anything up to about 2 to 3 feet high. And there's going to be some ratio of press, absorb, poke. And those ratios might change based on speed, size, shape. But generally, all three of them are usually there. And then advanced and up, advanced to expert riders that are starting to do 4, 5, 6 foot drops and higher speeds. That's where they might start to drop one of those three. So if they're going really fast, but it's a small drop, they might drop the poke completely, for example. I think we touched on that one earlier. Or if they're going fast and it's quite a big drop and the landing's not very far out, they're going to need to kind of absorb the drop and suck it up and get the bike on the ground quickly. They'll definitely have to get rid of the poke. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that? In that scenario, how does a rider kind of dynamically absorb and poke together? Because it's in that sense where some people call it scrubbing. We're not quite scrubbing, but it's very similar to it, where we're going off a big fast drop and we're kind of absorbing the last 2 feet of the lip. We're basically taking the drop back.
Yeah, I think
the rider kind of combine that absorb and poke together in one dynamic movement.
Yeah, I think an analogy is very helpful here for the rider. Just imagining a marionette, where the arms and the legs are connected by some sort of string, and so as the arms extend, your legs are flexing as well. Your knees are flexing, so that it's almost a single movement, right? Where you're trying to really suck up that edge so that it's not impacting the trajectory. But yeah, that idea of the marionette, the string that's attached to the arms to the legs. Yeah.
I mean, and I think it's worth considering too for our listeners. Like any of this stuff you're not sure about, you've got questions about, don't just jump on your bike and go, oh, I'm going to go try that. Like, get a coach, get someone to film you, build up to things gradually, because ultimately the goal of this podcast is not necessarily to take it away as a mountain bike lesson and go apply it. It's really just to discuss concepts, to pique interest and to give you an insight into some of the information that can help you tackle drops more effectively. So just bear that in mind. We haven't shown you demos. We don't have videos here. We're not with you on the trail to correct your technique and give you feedback and analysis. So just be careful out there using or applying any of the concepts we've just touched on today.
Cool. Hey, Paul, before we go, donut of the day, forgot to mention this. I had a faux pas last episode where I tried to sub out cinnamon roll for donut. I'm feeling a little guilty about that. I promise I'm going to work harder. I'm going to get out there. I'm not going to settle for a cinnamon roll. What do you got for us today?
That's good. Today where was I recently? I was in Byron. Was it Byron Bay? No, it was the airport. I can't actually remember where it was. Anyway, I had this apple fritter, and there's an apple fritter and then there's an apple fritter, and this was huge. It was like a bear claw size. It was like the size of 2 of my hands, and I swear it had like a whole apple in it. It was so good. So that's my donut of the day. It was like a Tim Hortons do a pretty good apple fritter. I'm not going to lie. If you can get a fresh apple fritter and they've just made it from Tim Hortons, they're pretty good. But this one was like a professional version of a Tim Hortons apple fritter, and it was good. It was really good. It went down well with my coffee. It was very good.
Excellent. And just to remind our listeners, donuts are good for you. They're healthy because they make you happy. It's important, starting out this new year to make sure that we're staying healthy and happy, and donuts can assist you in that.
Yeah. And if you eat them within half an hour of you finishing your workout, it's going to help your recovery.
There you go. You heard it here.
Yeah.
All right.
Science.
Sweet. All right, y'all. That brings us to the end of another episode of Donuts and Bikes. We hope this conversation elevated your understanding of drops from a rider's perspective or a coach's perspective. We like to think that riding bikes isn't rocket science, It's just bike science. So get out there, ride smart, and don't forget to have fun.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and that it sparked some ideas for your riding and your coaching. As always, our approach to coaching is on pros and cons, not rights and wrongs. And with that in mind, our podcast is meant to be more of a conversation about topics and techniques rather than a final say in how to ride or how to teach. As always, please take care if using or applying any of the techniques discussed in this podcast. Stay safe, ride smart, and we'll see you next time.